Hello and welcome back to this two-part series on bonds. In this video, the second in the series, we're going to be talking about interest, price and yield, three of the most important concepts when it comes to understanding bonds. So I'm going to start by talking about interest and then go into price and yield. So starting with interest, one important thing to know is it's often called coupon, and coupon simply means when you enter into a bond the interest rate that's determined at the very beginning. Then the next thing to understand is how is the interest rate set when a bond is being sold to you and you have the opportunity in the first place to actually lend the money to this organization or government. So that's often depending on the interest rates of that country or the world generally. So at the moment, where we live in very low interest rate environments around the world, the interest rate generally you'd expect to be quite low. So when the European Central Bank has a 0% rate, well, that means that generally the benchmark is relatively low when it comes to determining the interest rate of a bond. Then the next thing is the riskiness of the investment. So of course, the higher the risk, the more buffer you're going to want, and the higher interest rate you're going to ask for. And duration also makes a big difference. So the longer you're lending the money for, the higher again the rate, because that adds an element of risk. And usually the longer you lend it for, the less time you have with your money, and that means you can't be doing something else with it. If you lend someone 5,000 for 10 years, well, it's tied up with them as opposed to lending it for 5 years. So to compensate for that difference, you're going to ask for a higher rate of interest, generally speaking. Finally, when it comes to interest, two important things to know. Bonds can often be fixed or floating rate in terms of their interest. And that means fixed is when you agree on the bond at the very beginning, when you agree on the lending terms, you say, okay, well, the interest rate for 10 years is going to be 2%, no matter what. Then floating, on the other hand, is to say it's going to be relative to interest rates more generally. So it starts off at what today's interest rates are, but if you're lending to someone for 20 years, you might want it to change and adjust to reflect what the current environment is for interest rates. So instead of being at flat 2%, it will be something like 1% plus the current interest rates. And so of course, as current interest rates change over time, this floats accordingly. So to give you an example of how this works in practice, I've chosen some three government bonds that go from pretty low interest rates to high interest rates, and you'll get a bit of an idea of why. So you can see US government bonds over different time frames. So for 1 year, if you lend to the US government, they'll be giving you about 0.1% in interest. For 5 years, 0.3%, and for 10 years, 0.6%. So you can see the longer you lend them to, as I said, the longer the duration, the higher the return they'll pay you, because you've locked up that money for so long. And you can see the interest rates in the US are about 0.3%. So that's well, they're 0 to 0.3, and that's what keeps their rates pretty low. As you can see, it's reflective of the generally low interest rates in that country. And now we move on to China, and you can see there you're getting more of a return if you lend to them. So for 1 year it's 2.2, still it's higher the longer you lend to them for the same reason of duration. It gets up to 3.1%, and you can see the reason there is, well, one of the reasons is interest rates are generally higher there. They're 3.9%, and there are many reasons why interest rates are higher in China, but you can see more generally there might be some more risks involved in lending money to China than there are in lending money to the US, so you expect a higher rate of return. And finally, Russia contrasts even more to both, and their 1 year return, if you lend to them, is about 7%, which is a very high rate, and that goes up to 7.7 if you lend to them for 10 years. And the reason again why it's high is, well, it's probably a riskier investment. You're less likely to get your money back if you give it to Russia for 10 years than you are if you give it to the US for 10 years. So that's what the market is telling you. And their interest rates are higher as well, at 4.5%. And that reflects some of this, and you can see why their general bond rates are higher. So the next important thing to then understand, now we have a bit more of a background on interest, is price and yield. And these are the inputs you'll see when you're coming to be able to buy a bond. So the first thing is the price. So when bonds are first issued, the first time a government or organisation offers them to the public, and you decide to lend them the money, they'll always be issued at 100, or usually, and that's just a flat figure of 100. Then the all-important part is to determine the yield, and the yield is the same thing really as the interest rate or the return, at least to begin with. So if you invest into this bond, if you lend them the money, if you buy a bond at any given time, your return will be what the yield is when you bought it. So the calculation for that is simply the interest rate of this bond divided by the price. That gives you the yield. And the important thing is that the yield changes as the price changes, as you can see in this calculation, because the interest rate always stays the same. That's determined at the very beginning. It's the same thing as the coupon we saw, but the price can change. And now we'll go into how this works with some examples and how the price might change. So let's use this example of Russia issuing 10-year government bonds. So we saw that the interest rate, which as I said is the same thing as the coupon that they offer you to lend them money for 10 years, is 7.7. Then the price that they issue them, as I say, to begin with is 100. So your yield is 7.7%, and that's the same thing really as the interest rate to begin with. And this is on day one. If you invest in them, you know that you give them, say, $100 or rubles, as the case may be, you will then be getting a return that's flat of 7.7% from there. Then the price might change because these bonds are tradable, and this is how the yield changes. So let's see, for example, what happens if the price goes up. So the interest rate stays the same because that was determined at the beginning, but the price has now gone up to 114 because of supply and demand. More people want to buy these bonds and want to sell them, so they have to pay more for them. So it goes to a yield now of 6.8%. That's 7.7, the flat coupon, divided by this new price of 114. So if you buy these bonds at 114, your yield is going to be 6.8% because you have to pay 114, and to pay 114, that gives you 7.7% in interest going forward. So it's not anymore that buying it for 100 and getting 7.7% return. And what are some of the reasons why the price might go up? Why people want to buy it? Well, especially in this very low interest rate environment, similar things happened. Yes, Russia is risky, but people are more willing to accept that risk because interest rates everywhere else are just so low, and that 7.7 looks pretty attractive and doesn't really reflect that risk and return that you see because of no other opportunities elsewhere. That's maybe one of the reasons, or maybe people are more confident in Russia going forward. So it means that if you buy now, your yield is somewhat lower than if you bought it at the very beginning. So let's see an example on the contrary, if the price goes down, and also in the corporate space. So this is a company issuing bonds. So let's say Philips, that we saw in the last video, issues a 5-year corporate bond. And we saw that they issued one recently for 1.4%. So when they first issue it, say the price is 100, as it usually is, then you have the yield to begin with is 1.4%, being the interest rate or coupon divided by the price at that point in time. So if you first invest, you know you're going to get a 1.4% return for 5 years. But say you don't invest at that time, you missed the boat and you want to invest later, but the price has gone down. Well, what is going to happen to your yield? Well, in that case, your yield will have gone up to 2%. And well, this is assuming that the price has gone down to 70. So that's because the interest rate is still the same at 1.4, but now the price is 70, so you're paying 70 for something that gives you 1.4% coupon. So now you suddenly get a 2% yield. So you've done better to wait and buy later, as opposed to with the Russian bonds, you would have done better to buy them straight away. And what's the reason why the price might have gone down, which I should say it hasn't? The reason is because, well, suddenly, one of the two reasons is suddenly Philips falls into some trouble, and they lose a big part of their their contracts, say to supply lighting or in the medical space, and suddenly their ability to pay back this bond looks a bit less likely, so the risk has gone up. So people are expecting a higher interest rate, so people want to sell the bonds because it's not worth holding them if they're only getting 1.4%, and then people will buy them now saying, well, 2% is about right for the yield. So you can see the yield is the most important factor when it comes to bond trading and people determining what price to pay. It's not, the price is somewhat arbitrary, it's more about what yield should you be getting. And another reason might be, in this case, interest rates have gone up, and the 1.4% that you were getting no longer seems particularly attractive. You'd be expecting a high interest rate. So let's now see some example of some funds you can buy into, or really one main fund here. And the reason being, as I've explained in previous videos, that unfortunately the bond market is not really open to everyday non-professional investors. So instead you have to go through a fund to really get exposure to large-scale bonds. Like you can't buy the Phillips bond, or you can't buy Russian government bonds directly. So this is Vanguard that we've seen in the video on ETFs. They do many different bond funds, and this is the Eurozone government bond ETF. So you can see here they have 379 bonds, and you now should be able to understand more about what this means by what they actually are holding. So 379 bonds, the effective YTM, which is the yield to maturity, is now 0.2%. And it's striking because the actual coupon, or the rates of the bonds that they hold, were actually 2.7% on average. That's when they were first issued. But because the price of all of them has gone up so much, you're actually only getting 0.2% yield. And that's a big part of the fact that interest rates have come down so much that people were willing to buy up those bonds more and more. And now what's deemed to be an appropriate yield for them is more to 2.2%. And you can see that the average maturity, so the length of those bonds, is 10 years. The quality is rated by professional banks as A+, and the average duration, so that's how much time is left on those bonds, is 8.4 years. So let's see how the fund is done knowing this. So you can see here it's gone pretty solidly since 2016, and a big part was a big rise in prices in 2019. And the reason for this, you could say, and throughout especially the second half of most of 2019, the first half really, is maybe more of a feeling of security in the EU, more demand for these older bonds that had high interest rates, as we said, at an average of something like 2.7%. And with such low interest rates generally, that was deemed to be a really good investment. So people wanted to buy them to get access to this yield, and that's what pushed the yield, if you buy in now, down to just 0.2%. You can see it came off a bit during Corona as the certainty looked less likely in the future, so people would have sold the bonds a bit and the yield therefore lowered. But you know that if you invest in this fund right now, unless the prices dramatically change, your return will be 0.2%. And that is a general introduction into how bond prices, bond yields work, and as I showed at the end, how you can get access to bonds through a fund. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.